Good morning. It's a delight to launch today's Ranadrill weekly podcast, where we delve into several interesting topics in energy sector, starting with oil, natural gas, LNG, energy transition, renewables, and decarbonization. Our subject today is facing a lot of criticism in global business, which is carbon prices. By the way, our episode of the day is titled "How Carbon Pricing in Europe Break the Rising Competition of China." Carbon pricing and even taxes are challenging scenarios for many countries, as their application on the ground seems very tough, as they certainly participate to bolster the inflation, which is hampering the economic growth in several cases. To discuss this in details with deep clarifications, I made a long research and I have discovered a specialized professional in carbon prices, pricing and taxes covering Europe and China. Allow me to welcome Yan Qin. She is principal analyst in Clear Blue Markets and she is based in Norway. Good morning, Yan. Welcome aboard.
Thank you, and nice to be here.
My pleasure. So let's start with the first, as you cover China and Europe, and we start with China. So China is the second biggest economy in the world, has hugely invested in renewables, and it's leading the solar energy generation in the world, but still heavily reliant on fossils to generate electricity, with a share of approximately 62% from coal, which is emitting more carbon compared to the other fossils. My question is very clear. Can China succeed to meet its carbon neutrality by 2060?
Yes, well, this is an important but also trillion-dollar question. So a bit of background. So in 2020, China announced its goal to peak emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Well, this 2060 target is 10 years below what a lot of developed countries, such as EU, had set. But this pledge still marks an important move, even for global climate actions. So yet, as China has pledged this goal, a lot of climate policies has been implemented. And for me, as a carbon market observer, I took some time to think, okay, what triggers China to commit to this climate goal? Then I realized two aspects. One is to achieve carbon neutrality. Also, it's for China. It's for China's own benefits to transform its economy, to transform the structure of its economy from energy-intensive industry to more modern industry, and especially in clean tech manufacturing. So this we have observed in the past years, also moving China's economy to more service-based. Well, second, achieving carbon neutrality is important for China also because China imported lots of fossil fuels, and using less energy and use more clean energy also helps China to cut its dependence on imported fossil fuels. So with this background, so that's why I believe that as it is serious that China announced this pledge, and China has implemented a lot of measures on both on the policy framework, institutional framework, and various very detailed policies from energy sector, from electricity sector to industrial policies such as clean manufacturing, improving energy efficiency, green products, etc. So these policies are being rolled out. And and of course, as you mentioned, China has been massively investing in renewables deployment, in renewables manufacturing and deployment as well. Last year alone, China installed 277 gigawatt of solar capacity into its grid. So this trend will continue. And yes, so I have no doubt China will succeed to meet its carbon neutrality goal by 2060 with a lot of policy support, but also with the vast funding needed. And I'm a quantitative analyst myself. Actually, I'm also, for the past few years, I was involved in a project, an international project with both with Chinese and Danish, US, and Norwegian think tanks, where it's called China Energy Transformation Outlook report, where we have used the team has used detailed modeling tools, both modeling China's energy system, how it can transit from a fossil-based system to a decarbonized system by 2060, and what has been happening, what is needed. And yet they modeled pathways. There are two scenarios in the report, which you can access at cet.energy. All the reports can be downloaded. You can see the modeling results. Yeah, the trajectory will show that yes, China can achieve its carbon neutrality goal most first and foremost in the energy system. And a key findings was electrification. You have China needs to electrify a lot of sectors, industry sector, transport, and even agriculture sector, also more in the residential sector, that's heating and cooling.
Yeah, and it started, I think, especially for the big trucks, for the buses. I think China
Yeah.
started. And
Mhm.
by the way, China now, Chinese AV companies made more than 9.7 million cars by 24, and this is a great achievement for Chinese industry.
Yes, so we do see, right, in Chinese term, this new industry called New Three. The New Three type of products, it's all in clean tech manufacturing, solar, wind, batteries, and plus also EVs, uh, which this vast manufacturing capacity, and I would say the very complete and efficient supply chain within China, with also easily available amount of skilled workers. And that is all contributing to ramping up this manufacturing capacity that for two purposes, serving the domestic needs and also exporting to globally to help other countries, regions for their energy transition goals.
Yeah, exactly. So talking from China, I want to move to one of the biggest partners of China, which is Europe. So one of the principal clients of China is Europe, as bilateral trade reached $762 billion in 24. Meanwhile, Europeans are setting tough regulations on most of the imported product by imposing carbon taxes. The Chinese industry will be hugely impacted. So winning off the Chinese product will leave the European market less competitive compared to the other markets. My question is, how can Europe balance between its targets, and its let's say its climate targets and its economic interest?
Well, yes, it's not in my position to give advice to European policymakers, but I am a European, at least climate policy observers, as I worked quite a long time with the European carbon market and energy markets. Well, to starting with the tougher regulations in terms of climate and specifically the carbon board adjustment mechanism, which has been launched and will officially entering its definitive phase in 2026. So charging a carbon tariff for goods imported into the EU at the border. Well, for this carbon tariff, well, it's EU launched this first global carbon tariff of this kind first. And also, but why I think this carbon tariff was supposed to tackle the so-called carbon leakage issue because the EU has had, or EU and UK, so Europe basically has had very strict climate legislations because of their climate leadership role, and the carbon price and carbon taxes has been high for EU industries. And for some sectors, this has led to of course, a disadvantages and has led to some production of EU industries being relocated to other regions. And this will, of course, hurt EU's basic competitiveness and local employment. So that is the concern. And so, yes, so by introducing carbon tariff at the border, the EU would level the playing field of EU goods and and imported goods from China, as you mentioned, the important trade partner, but also from Turkey and from other regions. And the essence is really to make goods containing the same carbon costs. Well, I would say as for the current stage, the impacts from the EU's carbon tariff on Chinese industry, specifically aluminum and steel export from China to the EU, they are quite limited. They are just a couple of percent. And also, I would
Sorry.
also say that uh, Chinese products, especially we if we only look at aluminum and steel sector only, Chinese products are competitive not only because they don't have carbon costs yet, but also because they have cheap labor costs, capital costs, land costs, etc. And reduce or adding this carbon costs only, as you said, it still makes Chinese products, or at least some of them, very competitive. And to making it even worse, it's being increasingly acknowledged even by European experts that the EU's carbon tariff might even make China to be more dominant in its green products exports to the
Yeah,
EU.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. How can we make the Chinese product competitive?
Mm.
Time electricity generated in China is 60% coming from coal. And how can we adhere to the new taxes imposed by European Union?
Yes, that's I think the overall impression of everyone is China's energy system is fossil based, and its electricity system is still mainly uh China's electricity system with coal is still taking the largest share. However, that is for average. If we look at Chinese provinces, it can be very different. I always make an example that I live in Norway, and I always compare Norway with Sichuan province in southern China, which is not only famous for its cuisine, but also famous for its rich hydropower. So yeah, that is in contrast to Eastern China or Central China, where I came from, where we basically have a lot of fossil fuel fired power plants, also fossil fuel used in industrial production. So I think that then considering a large Chinese steel enterprise, it can have facilities in a green province or in a brown or dark province. So here it's really makes the same large corporate its product, and it can have products at different level of green content. So those green products from this enterprise will be still be quite competitive, even adding because they will be subject to very low carbon costs even.
Yeah, that's good. That's very, very good. Thank you so much for your insight and for the clarifications.
Yeah.
Talking about the price, the carbon price in European Union.
Mm.
So the European Union carbon price is around 80 euros and far above the level of carbon price in emerging economies. Chinese carbon price is only 13 euros. Meanwhile, carbon taxes among European countries are ranged from less than 1 euro per ton CO2 equivalent, reaching 99 euros in Norway, for example. You don't think this imbalance of tariffs between members of the European Union will stimulate few of them to acquire more Chinese products, paving
Mm.
the way to foster extra Chinese goods to the European Union?
Yes, but this good question, but this is exactly the purpose when the carbon border adjustment mechanism was brought up
Mhm.
to leveling again the carbon cost between the EU, which is very high, and with China representing the emerging economies where carbon price is still very low, as you have the good numbers
Yeah, thank you.
comparison there. And but one thing is that the other purpose of the EU's carbon tariff is to drive a momentum for global carbon pricing. So for me, as a carbon market analyst, the past 3 years has been very exciting. So the EU's CBAM, the EU's carbon tariff, has really put pressure on China to speed up the construction of its own national carbon market, as well as including the basically CBAM industry sectors into the national carbon market. And of course, the price is still very low, but the significance is that it's the EU CBAM, the EU carbon tariff, really make China leaning more towards carbon pricing. And so I think that's a quite important perspective that the CBAM has achieved. And also in addition, because of this, right, because of the establishment of a carbon market for the industries in China, the steel aluminum producers in China, they are increasingly learning how to clearly monitoring and precisely and into great detail monitoring their CO2 emissions. So that
Decarbonize,
is also
decarbonize, yeah.
yeah, yeah, helping them to decarbonize when they, I think to make them accept the concept that they have to pay for their carbon emissions is already a step forward. Uh, yeah, but of course, as you mentioned, China's carbon price is still quite low, and it is unlikely to reach the level of the European carbon price because of climate legislations. Climate targets are very strict in the EU. So these carbon cost differentials will still stay and for, I don't know, 10, 15 more years. And but I think as I highlighted, to make the energy intensive enterprises in emerging economies realize that there is a price on carbon, and also to make the enterprises to realize that going green is the new competitiveness. This is important, and this trend will continue. But at
Yeah,
the same time, we also see, yeah, the EU will refine its CBAM at its entering the definitive phase from 2026. So everything is still moving and also being fine-tuned at the same time.
yeah. And this is the big question. So the world still are relying on fossil energies by 80% to meet its energy needs. So tightening taxes, regulations such CBAM will certainly impact the global economy by spiking inflation. Few countries, I think you agree about that. Few countries may support this burden, but developing countries will be largely affected by its consequences. So, do you believe that subsidies are a plan B to encourage these countries to lessen the carbon footprint?
Well, to begin with the broader picture, I'm a believer that energy transition will happen at the global scale and is the trend. Because why? Because the resources for the whole world is limited. So we need energy transition and for a country on itself to be less reliant on imported fossil fuels, as your rooftop solar can provide you some energy, and especially from an energy security perspective to some extent. Uh, on the other hand, energy efficiency, energy savings is also important in the wider concept of energy transition. The best energy is what is not being used. So that's important. I believe many more countries, even in the emerging economy, they are acknowledging this. But of course, that's where when I observe global climate negotiations, then we have China representing BRICS country, the emerging economies, because right in terms of global climate actions, it was China's position is common but differentiate responsibilities. With emerging economy, of course, they're still growing and their energy consumption is still in a phase of growing. That is exactly why for China set a goal to peak emissions before 2030. And we would not like to see absolute emission decline until probably a plateau period after that. So we need such a period to give some room for emerging economies to both grow economy at the same time ramping up the renewable energy adoption or alternative energy adoption to finally reach the tipping point where incremental energy growth only coming from clean energy. So there we need to be patient. And also, yeah, exactly. At the same time, if we implement super strict, say, say, green trade barriers or very strict carbon tariffs for the emerging economies and leading to a squeeze, let's say, both in fossil fuel prices and also in terms of inflation, as you mentioned. We should avoid the situation of creating a temporary squeeze for the emerging economies, give them some room to breathe. So yeah, I conclude on one word. For China's way to energy transition is called setting up the new first, and then breaking up the old. So not be so drastic.
Yeah, I think there is contradiction when we talk about applying taxes on the
Yeah.
European Union. So how Europeans will apply tighten regulations on
Yeah.
all imported product from China, from emerging economies. Time the European economy is still relying on fossils. I give you an example. For example, Germany, electricity generated there is about 27, 28%. Still relying on natural gas, still relying on oil, still relying on coal. How can you really impose taxes on other product? Time in your market, you still relying on fossils. You don't think this is a contradiction in this?
Yes, that's a very good point. And the data you mentioned about Germany really reflects what we say a resilient and patient pathway to energy transition. One cannot hurry to go to 100% renewables tomorrow, but do recognize the role of fossil fuels as, let's say, as a backup fuel in the power system temporarily, and also as a backup energy resources, also for many other applications, to have a steady pathway to energy transition. And yeah, as for the contradiction, one would think for the EU, but I would say it's actually very consistent. As in 2019, in the EU announced Green Deal, and also later on with the Fit for 55 package, with its 2030 climate energy package, with the series of legislations being implemented, covering a lot of sectors, including the carbon tax legislation, the carbon tariff. What I think they all serve for different purposes. And of course, policy is being revised. As last year, we all heard about the famous Draghi report on EU's industry competitiveness. So, well, yes, and we are going to hear more about these policies, such as the Clean Industry Deal from EU coming up in February. So here, I heard a phrase called EU Green Deal 2.0. That is to consider both energy security and industrial competitiveness. So for me, I observe really the priority has shifted a little bit, but also more towards the current focus is a lot on industrial competitiveness in the EU. So which makes this carbon tariff leveling the same carbon cost is important. But at the same time, the EU's goal of reaching climate neutrality is stay unchanged.
Okay. I have to thank you so much, thousands times for your clarifications and your engagement, your commitment with us to share your expertise and your insights regarding the carbon and the controlling the carbon and taxes, tariffs in China and Europe and inside the European Union, and we can balance the trade between China and the European Union. So again, thank you so much for your contribution, and I hope to see you again in another podcast in the future.